This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Aaron Matte. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We begin with Syria. Syria's foreign minister has announced Syria has accepted a Russian proposal to surrender control over its chemical weapons. France responded by saying it would ask the UN Security Council to approve a resolution demanding that Syria place its chemical arms under international control. The Russian initiative was apparently sparked by remarks made by Secretary of State John Kerry on Monday about what Syrian President Bashar al-Assad could do to prevent a U.S. attack.
Sure, he could turn over every single bit of his chemical weapons to the international community in the next week. Turn it over, all of it, without delay, and allow a full and total accounting for that. But he isn't about to do it, and it can't be done, obviously.
That was Secretary of State John Kerry speaking on Monday in London. A short while later in Moscow, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov appeared before reporters and seized on Kerry's remarks.
We don't know if Syria agrees to it, but if putting chemical weapons in this country under international control averts the military strikes, then we will immediately get to work on this with Damascus. We also call on the Syrian leadership not only to put chemical weapons storage facilities under international control, but also to destroy it afterwards.
While Syria's foreign minister has announced Syria will accept the Russian proposal to surrender control over its chemical weapons, Syria's main opposition group, the Syrian National Coalition, dismissed the initiative as a diplomatic trick, saying it would allow the regime to cause more death and destruction in Syria. In Washington, D.C., the State Department appeared to walk back Kerry's statement, saying he was making a hypothetical, rhetorical argument. But as the day wore on, President Obama said he's open to exploring Russia's proposal and confirmed he discussed it with Russian President Vladimir Putin at the G20 summit last week. Speaking to PBS News, Obama said the Russian offer could mark a breakthrough so long as it's backed by the threat of military force.
If, in fact, there's a way to accomplish that diplomatically, that is overwhelmingly my preference. I have instructed John Kerry to talk directly to the Russians and run this to ground. And if we can exhaust these diplomatic efforts and come up with a formula that gives the international community a verifiable, enforceable mechanism to deal with these chemical weapons in Syria, then I'm all for it. But we're going to have to see specifics. And I think it is reasonable to assume that we would not be at this point if there were not a credible military threat standing behind the norm against the use of chemical weapons.
President Obama's comments came as the push for military intervention faced new obstacles in Washington. As Congress returned from the summer recess to begin debating a U.S. strike on Syria, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid said he will delay a test vote on military authorization scheduled for Wednesday. In a new setback for the White House, Democratic Senator Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota said she would oppose military authorization and threw her support behind a proposal from Democratic Senator Joe Manchin to give the Assad regime 45 days to endorse the international ban on chemical weapons. In the House, a new whip count by the Washington Post shows a majority of Congress members, 240, are either against or leaning against voting to authorize military strikes on Syria.
Opinion polls continue to show a majority of Americans oppose military intervention. According to the New York Times, 56% of Americans are against Obama's plan for military strikes, while 90% believe it'll spark a more widespread war in the Middle East. As the debate over Syria takes a new turn, violence inside the country claimed the lives of at least 49 people Monday, including 25 around the capital, Damascus. For more on Syria, we're joined now by two guests. We're joined by Rafeef Jouaijati, English language spokesperson for the Syrian Local Coordination Committees, a network of activists throughout Syria, and Rania Masri, Lebanese-based human rights activist and professor at the University of Balamand in Lebanon. She joins us from Raleigh, North Carolina. Why don't we begin in Washington, D.C. with Rafeef Jouaijati. What is your assessment of Syria saying they would accept Russia's proposal, which came out after Secretary of State Kerry's seemingly offhand remark, although it looks like President Obama said he's now discussed this with Russian President Vladimir Putin, putting chemical weapons, Syria putting their chemical weapons under international control?
Well, certainly that's a welcome move, but I think it's a stall tactic. Let's keep in mind that just last night, Bashar al-Assad refused to confirm or deny that his regime actually possesses chemical weapons. So apparently this is an admission that they do possess them. And I'm reminded of other international initiatives like the Kofi Annan Plans 1 and 2 and the Lakhdar Brahimi UN plan, where the Assad regime agreed to pull back tanks from civilian areas and then failed to do so. So I'm not sure this really has any teeth.
And your response, Rania Masri, of these latest fast-moving developments as President Obama is expected to address the nation tonight, and he was expected to make a push for war to a majority unconvinced country, the people of the United States.
Yes, well, I think it strongly reveals both President Obama's international isolation, with his only main ally supporting a bombing campaign against Syria being the Saudis, who have themselves funded many of these so-called rebels in Syria. And at the same time, President Obama is facing increasing domestic opposition from the Republicans to the Democrats across the political spectrum. What I see coming out of Russia, actually, is proof of the power of political settlements and of the importance of diplomacy, given the horrendous consequences of a bombing campaign on Syria, and particularly on the Syrian people, and giving the extraordinary need for a political settlement. This demonstration by the Russian government and the Syrian government shows a strong possibility towards the power of a political settlement. And I think it also reveals a great deal that those who claim to speak on behalf of the Syrian people here in the United States, be it either the Syrian National Coalition or the National Coalition for Syrian Revolutionary and Opposition Forces, any of these so-called opposition forces here in the U.S., how they have been so adamant to support a bombing campaign against their own country. And yet when we look into who they are, we see that they are actually puppets representing Saudi Arabia much more than they represent the people of Syria.
Let's get a response to that from Rafif Jouejati. Your assessment of Rania's statement that exiled Syrian groups are unfairly backing a bombing campaign.
I think many in the Syrian expatriate communities certainly do favor a military strike. This is not because they are puppets of the Saudi government, as Rania says. This is not because they don't represent the Syrian people. I believe this is because many, many Syrians inside Syria, not in the United States, but inside Syria, feel that Assad will not stop unless he is stopped militarily. This is the man who is responsible for the deaths of more than 100,000 civilians. This is the regime that is responsible for the internal displacement of at least 4 million people, 2 million refugees abroad. So Syrians who are inside are feeling that there is no hope but for a military strike.
Actually, if I can respond to that, if I may, I did not claim that the Syrian expat community in the United States were puppets. I specifically said that those who claim to represent the Syrian National Council and the National Coalition for Syrian Revolutionary Forces are, be they George Sabra, who has gone on record as supporting Samir Jaja, a right-wing fascist and an ally of Israel, or Ahmed al-Jarba, who is a known convicted drug dealer and who is a strong supporter of the Saudis. This is clear. As for your number of 100,000, again, it falls into this very detrimental binary. We're very familiar with the crimes of the Syrian regime. However, to present it that the Syrian regimes are the only ones right now in Syria that are committing crimes of atrocity is false, and it's not even supported by the pro-opposition Syrian Human Rights Observatory. And they themselves, this pro-opposition Syrian Human Rights Observatory, recognizes that 43% of that figure of 100,000 fatalities, 43% of them are Syrian army combatants. And when we look at these rebel groups in Syria, we understand, even according to Secretary of State John Kerry, that 15 to 20% of them are known terrorists with affiliates to Al-Qaeda or worse, and that the others, the so-called Free Syrian Army, actually work with Al-Qaeda, as numerous statements from these so-called Free Syrian Army battalions have revealed, including this latest atrocity of the attack against Ma'lula, one of the most ancient Christian villages in the world. We have this attack against Ma'lula, which in no way can be regarded as an attack against a Syrian army strong post. It can only be seen what it is, an attack against Christians, because many of whom that are leading this armed fight against the Syrian regime are unfortunately takfiris. What is lost throughout all this binary presentation is the people of Syria themselves, the non-violent civil society movements within Syria. The people of Syria themselves, they are the ones caught between the Syrian regime and the Free Syrian Army and Al-Qaeda. And unfortunately, it is their voices that are being lost, and it is their voices that we hear through numerous networks that have continued to say no to a bombing campaign, no to military intervention, yes to political negotiations, yes to humanitarian aid.
Your response, Rafiq.
Can I respond to that? Because there are so many points that got convoluted in that statement. First of all, it's not the so-called Free Syrian Army. It is actually called the Free Syrian Army, which is a largely secular group. Certainly no one is disputing the presence of Islamists, foreign jihadists in the country, but we recognize that these are a minority, and we recognize that Syrian civilians across the country have come out in protest against them, saying we will not trade one dictatorship for another. Second of all, I do represent the nonviolent community, the civil society community that is on the ground in Syria. The local coordination committees has been documenting the deaths of the 100,000 plus civilian casualties. We also document the atrocities committed by members of the armed opposition. So I'm not excusing those, and I'm not saying there's a binary argument here. We do say yes to humanitarian aid. We do say yes to stop the killing. But the LCC has said, if the international community is going to do something, let it stop the murderer, let it stop the massacres, let it stop the bombing campaigns against civilian communities, whether these campaigns are done via Scud missile, whether they're done via barrel bombs at civilian bread lines in Aleppo, for example.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion.